Man, so it's a good night. I really ain't. My name is Solomon Paschal-Desbin. How are you doing? Facebook Solomon Paschal-Desbin on Instagram. That's Paschal-Desbin on Twitter. Man. Here on YouTube is Solomon Paschal-Desbin Music. Yeah, music spelled M-U-Z-I-Q. You know, can we talk? Alright, let's talk. Well, uh, of course I love music. Who doesn't, right? You know, when I think about it, and I really don't have to, it comes in all shapes, forms, and genres. You don't really too often, well, me, per se, I really don't like to think or try with it anymore. You know, when in 2000, I don't know what year that was, might have been about 13. I was riding down the car. How y'all doing? How y'all doing? I was riding down in the car, right? And I turned on the radio. I ain't too much for the radio as is anyway. It can be awesome, but in its own right. So I was just riding down the street and I heard this song on the radio. And it just sounded fresh and clean and but it had this little pristine sound to it. Almost like I kind of heard that before in a way. So I was like, all right, whatever. But I liked it. I liked it. So it wasn't all right, whatever. So, I'm like, wow. Ding, 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 ding. I'm like, I've heard that guitar somewhere before. Sure enough is that man. So, ah. Ding, 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 ding. So I heard this guitar, so I turned it up, and the sound, this was just, so, about halfway through the song, I might have like just wanted to, I was just, I don't think that they said who the artist was, so I was trying to remember what I was, actually the song, so I could figure this out when I got home. But instantly, hearing this song on the radio, whilst coming home, I instantly, man, that might have been one of the best songs I heard in a long time. Before they played that song when they got to the Grammy Awards. So, early on, it was right when the song had got released as a single, the lead single from, some album that was just released that year. So, but I recognized, at first it was like, huh? And then I started hearing it, and then I'm like, I've got to look this up. So, let me remember the words to this and what's going on. But I kind of figured it was some group that I really, had past enjoyment with prior before, but it was like on another, you know, and then it was so thick and meaty potatoes of what it was prior before. if you understood what kind of music and breakbeat and kind of what they were doing prior before. So, so I immediately, ouch. So I immediately searched this out, and um, for it as said, these people are going to be bringing this music album out, and you know, and so I immediately, went to the store and picked this album up, but just immediately after just hearing the song one time on the radio. Um, there in that song, and when I got home, when I got home, I really didn't want to, I wanted to buy the album a little bit before I listened to it. Maybe I might have listened to a single or something, or maybe not, or maybe a couple of the songs after that. But I didn't really listen to the, it's just like, instead of me, so I made sure I got to the store and immediately, and just made sure that so I pulled out my CD cassette player and threw on my headphones. Waited till nighttime. I turned off all the lights and I just listened to this album, maybe for about 2 weeks straight. And for this album was actually my solace, actually, you know, um, around that time, I took a break from it for a long time because it gets lost in the song. So, within this album, this guy says, there's this, look, that guitar man, that person of that guitar is, I don't want to name drop somebody, but it's privy that you say something. I love good disco music, and I love you a lot of music. So don't give me any backlash from this or start anything from it. I just want to give the person kudos for that Chuck Chuck guitar sound. Is actually one of the most, that guitarist is one of the most famous guitarists in the world. Actually, and he's been on more hits than probably anyone you could ever freaking imagine. Mr. Niles Rogers himself. So, in which I recognized that sound coming off of that guitar. So I immediately went and bought that album because it lined up with somebody else and another musician prior before that. So upon listening to this album, the first thing I looked at, was I sat there and I looked at the record company for a long time, because I really didn't hear most of the album when I was just, perusing through it on the internet. Okay, when I got on YouTube, I just listened to it a little bit. I was like, okay, okay, I just, I don't even think I really did that, really, besides re-listening to the song that I heard prior on the radio. not really looking at the listing and all that, and not too much of the information there on the album. So I looked at this album cover, for a long time. For they just had their face just sitting there. Um, they're just looking, uh, and then right there at the freaking, and I'm like, man, I've seen that writing there at the top of that, because I didn't see that on the internet out there. I think I saw that prior to going to, um, to the store there to pick this album up. I don't think I don't recall that connection there from that, you know. So I went to get this, so I was sitting there holding this cassette disc, or this, CD, yeah, cassette disc, and, I'm like, I've seen that before. Wow. So, so I'm looking at the way it's written in this, and I'm like, wow, okay, okay, okay. Pretty simple there. I kind of like the silver and gold there. Yeah. So, I listened through the album all the way. And then I'm not counting too much or nothing, I'm not digging through it or nothing, but, you know, but I'm really getting to this album. Anticipation of listening to it, kind of actually now thinking about it and wanting to or not kind of makes you go, whoa. And for I did just take aspirin, you know. So, but there's this part on this album where another person, a prominent musician there from there in the 70s, right? Uh, so, he says, it's something I'm paraphrasing. He says, I wanted to, I've always wanted to be a musician. It was very tough for me to be a musician or something like that. But when I finally broke away from school, I became a musician. Um, when sometimes I had to sleep in the car. I had to sleep in the car. He said I might have had about 6 or 7 or 8 songs, but I had to go to, at the time I went to the discotheques because they already had discotheques. Uh, I always wanted to do a sound of music that had sounds of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the future. But he didn't know, you know, what to do, so he put the sync on the move module. But no, but he knew I didn't know what to use, but the synthesizer. I can use the synthesizer. I didn't know what type of music he had. Some of he didn't know what type of music he was going to create. So he put the sync on the modular. Something like, and then somewhere prior before that statement, he has said, when, or later on, end quote, and later on the music plays on, and then, and something like that. Then, paraphrasing quotation again, something as of the fact of when you want to create music, forget about music being correct, because no one told me, you know, I had no idea what to do. No one told me what to do or something like that. You have to think about it. It's like, it's kind of like to him, it's totally abstract, and like, in quotation before that. So it's like for him, it's kind of like abstract. So he doesn't, so I'm the answer to why I'm looking at it, right? So then listening to this album just over and over, think, right? Like, what if you could, like, just like, it's kind of like, the way I look at it, let's say you have a chalkboard or an easel board, right? And you've been writing on it your whole life, or you've been writing. Sometimes you're writing something good, sometimes you're that, and sometimes saying, I will not, and then sometimes it's something else or the other, right? Let's say you wipe that chalkboard down. Let's say you give it a chalkboard easel treatment. Through the years, how excited would you get if you got a new chalkboard or you got a new easel? So in my mind, from the years and the time between 13 and 14 when I re-entered into the studio, forget about music. Yeah, music doesn't exist. For it didn't exist to him when I'm creating, right? So it doesn't exist. You get a new thing on life. It gets to wipe away. It gets to, when you're in your creative zone, right? Not that it doesn't disappear, your career disappears, for that would be something that is a hurt. If you were to ask him, maybe that ain't what I'm talking about. So, like when you're going to move forward on the new creation that you're going to create, when you're, looking at what you're gonna do and create, right? So, so not that anything prior before, anything there, but how peppered in all this stuff has always been. So when you're, you know, when I myself, you know, had decided to, well, I knew I wanted to continue with music, but I didn't know, but I knew kind of before that with an album here, the definition of soul. And then I did some other music in 13 around the same time, which was kind of, inlaid through some stuff, but it wasn't that. But then going, on the other side of kind of what was going here, you know, between, for that music album that was released in 13, right about around in the time where I would have been kind of coming to a whole new. It wasn't like a book being closed. Or, it was kind of like that Notebook, kind of like oof, oof, and then like the ability for that album to kind of ride in through September. I think that might have been around the time of September. Between like August, September, October, maybe around that time when it was just going to hit the radio, just enough time for the Grammys, for it to hit around the end of summer, coming into August time. Enough time to sweep into the Grammys or whenever that was. By that time, oof, I was about, and then like it hit, so I'm able to sit here and, you know, concentrate and listening to that album for months on repeat. Um, uh, you know, so by the time that Grammy Awards had come around in January or Feb, I don't know when the Grammy Awards actually are. February, beginning of February, first opening weekend of February, something like that. So, it's pretty much like, wow, you know what I mean? But I had already said it. Like when I was listening to the album, I was like, that's it, that's it. And, that's it the first time I heard it on the radio. That's it. And then I sat back and listened to it, and I was breaking through this album one by one, just listening. I don't know what the Academy Award listening, but I do, but I don't. But I sat there and I was counting on my finger, and I literally had said, I was like, that's three plus. That's a three plus. So that's a three plus. They're gonna clean house on this one. I said they're going to clean house this year on that album. Just the first time I walked out, went and grabbed the album, listened to it on repeat the whole time. They're going to clean house on this album. They should be one of the best that you get. So, I listened to it, and yeah, sure enough, that I think I haven't seen the Grammy Awards since then. I may have read a few things here and now and then, a few articles about what's happening. Because I indeed, you know, um, upon that album, who in 2014, indeed, I think they won about 4 Grammys. Uh, I believe. Um, because that's where I was at and where I stayed. Um, so when he said that about making music, right? And about himself. Right? I kind of thought about that pretty heavy. If I could just, I can feel that. So, like, yeah, like I understand kind of like what it's like to be kind of in that situation, and kind of, how you could be holding on to maybe just a little tiny bit into what you have been going through, and maybe about what you have lost and maybe what you haven't, and, as a musician, and kind of like how it was really tough. Um, for him to present himself on that album. Yeah, more as a seasoned person to begin. But that wasn't the importance of it. The importance of it was, the importance of the album itself. Right? If you actually, look at that record cover and then, they took this out, right? And then how the recording process of it. Right? And if you take what he had said to where he had created music through, the synthesizer being connected to the Moog module to create music from the 60s, 70s, and the 50s, 60s, 70s, or however he said that, and then Sound of the Future, because how he was creating music onto the set. And he didn't know what to do, so he connected, I used the synthesizer, so I connected the synthesizer to the Moog module. And then I just needed a click. I didn't know what I did, but it could create it, whatever you said after that. And then you hear. So, you know, um, if you ever heard that album all the way across, if you ever recognized that writer, that was, you know, right there on it. And if you ever listening, if you ever kind of got into the techniques and kind of how they didn't, manipulate the music and the sounds or harass it or do anything with it, but how they, moved it from here to here, and then moved it from here to here, and then, and then kind of just, what they, and then how they used their techniques on how what they did prior in the past until how they moved it, into what they were doing for their plan for the future. How they have a little bit of computer to the real, but then not to the real to the computer. When it's finally processed and done until what is done, until how they practiced it and practiced it into that, and then and then to the recording, and then the movement of the recording, and then back there, and then how they, if you've read the process in which how they made that album, right? And then how they had that drummer come in and play that, and play that song, and then, in the process that they did, and then, it's just, I mean, but there's so much that, well, and then, that four is pretty dang on good. Four is pretty dang on good. Four is pretty strong. So, it was it's pretty beautiful. So, you know, um, it's just, when uh so prior to, just nothing kind of is the same. Nothing has been the same after actually that. I never, it's just, if someone asks like, has something ever really like, to where you get upset to where you're like, man, look, he's kind of like you're like, and it's like, no, no, because to me it was like, me myself, I slept in my car for years, and I've slept outside for years for the dream of music, and that I realized that, if I'm a musician, um, I got a lot of chastisement from somebody and people, and said, man, and then when you did get a little bit of money, you bought a car instead of getting back into this. And, a lot of it was because of, I said like, and I'm like, I said you never followed anybody, but obviously you followed that person instead of that. Well, kind of, they tried to, I feel like they tried to kind of do the same thing that you denied to take somewhere else. Them kind of devaluing you as stupid because unlike that quintessential person in music, they denied your opportunity continuously too for the fact of that music album and loving that music album to begin. Called it, not, and then to create a career, you know, unto, you know, when when it really mattered of people listening and prior before it was kind of like all right, man, that's just solid, man, that's actually all right. And then when it was like no, and it's like the and it wasn't because of no one knowing really what was going on, because it was like, how stupid could you be to constantly forget, of the explosion and the movement and the eyes that would be watching and taking information at that moment. Uh, of certain technologies to be using without VPNs and other stuff, or protections under a company to begin with. But that doesn't matter. It's neither here nor there. But the real thing of the matter is, that was something that actually I had thought about when they said, how serious would you be about something, you know? So for that, it was like that was actually really done within that career that had once existed for me. Um, because when that person, said that about, because I felt like I had never really reached me, or and like forever was always being broken with something else and finding out, of my true artistry, or maybe how, like, never, like years prior before that, it was like, man, how could you be when you're like 20, you're like here in your late 20s and you're a good musician, but you never really have sang, Or like you never really have. I mean, what if you knew you could fly, but you didn't get to fly until you almost could. I mean, until you couldn't fly. You know, and then so forever you're always saying, "Man, I could have flown." So um, but you could fly, but you never. You mean so you forever saying? I mean, so but then having my own but but then being able to, um, I was in the studio one time. I had started messing around with a few songs, So I was like, okay, I'm gonna put these. Okay, I'm gonna start recording. So prior to before I had left off on a whole nother album, you know, for what was going for some other stuff, but not really. It was like whatever, Not that it was whatever, but it's like, it's just something else, right? I don't know how to explain it. I finally got this studio together. You know, I didn't touch anything. I put the foam. I put the foam all over the place. I got it together. Made sure everything was rigged up there correct. Ready to go. All knobs ready, buttons ready to be pushed. You know, I made sure everything was, at first, you have to, make sure everything's kind of, you get your stuff, your mic synced the right way. You make sure that your delay, your mic delay is right, and when you're making sure that that when you're putting your info in, the distance between the microphone and the ear, and and everything that you're doing, because you hi, and like hi, if you're listening in on yourself, I don't want to hear it, and then everything that's feeding in. There's a lot of stuff you got to do in there, technical stuff, and I did all my thing. I don't do that. So like, don't do that bad. So like, so I get everything going real good. So I start working on this, I'm like, okay, okay, okay. Let me run me a few little drabs here back. All right, so yeah, I started scribbling on this piece of paper. I started singing this song. When I went to, I went with these lyrics, and then I was listening to the song. The first thing that I kind of wanted to go at, and then maybe about 3 lines into the first verse, I pressed the space bar. Then I played that back, delete. So then I hit the red button again. I went a little bit further. Stop. Space bar. All right, let me see how it feels if I double that up. So I ran one back. Space. So I tightened that up just a little bit. Looked at them curves a little bit. Put that back at the beginning. Space. Space. All right, so then I took that notebook, threw that notebook to the side. Named that song real quick, moved on to the next one. I said, I'm gonna give this one Okay, a little drab. So I did the same thing, and this time I tried it with something else. Yeah, and luckily I didn't puke getting to the end of the song. So I ran that back maybe a couple of times sitting there. Okay, okay, awesome. Then I thought about it, and I said, this song, sound you are kicking out exactly what was in that freaking out. You are kicking out these words, how you feel. But when I started listening, it sounds like that song that is in that album way prior before. Very interesting, bro. Very freaking interesting. Space, no, save, export, MP3, X, shut down. So then I decided to walk away. So I walked over and laid down. I just went on and just watched something else. It's just whatever. Okay. Okay, it's gonna be a while before I get back up in here. Before it took me a minute to get back to, back to where I need to be, because I just had spinal surgery. So a little bit between here and there, a little bit more, a little bit other stuff I had to do. Okay, did little things, around to and fro. So then I got right back to where I was at before. So I said, okay. Got back in the studio and, you know, picked up another notepad, grabbed my pen, started writing. So, okay, there it is. Okay, okay, okay. You know, you know, little bit of emptiness and, you know, you know, for what it actually was and what I was doing actually there within the music, you know. Of course, because, when and then the music just like, you know, it may sound like it's going backwards or like when you're listening to everything, but then really, so, and then what I had noticed was the progression, from myself within all those years as a music artist myself, right? Um, for where one song starts, it kind of goes into you know, where in those 2 years, how it's layered and how meaty and how chunky each album actually was. By the time you got to like 1 year, it's like when you're starting off in an album, actually, and how I was able to go through it, and then if, like, what I mean, like wow, when I think of some of these song titles, they don't exist anymore. So let's not bring them up. Let's not get too attached. Before they do. For they were on an MP3 player once again. That it's like I had this one song called, and I don't want to say it at all. So uh, it was to what I was able to do, in the musicianship, and then within the writing, and then the production, to the arrangements, to the, into like going from to and fro with a lot of stuff, and then, oh, excuse me, still able to maintain what was going on. But on top of all that, the ability to consistently, you know, but because in which, when, you know, at one point it was like, wow, you know, I felt like, it was a good thing because it could have went all the way back around for like years on prior. Like who else couldn't do that, right? But at its consistency and supreme consistency. But what had happened already was the pure non-existence of another, you know, and then able to, like, and it's not like you forgot, it's not like you still did the same thing, you know, because somewhere between the time where I tossed that notebook to just set it down, I wrote in that notebook, set it down. Just put that notebook right there on that little desk, went on to whatever I was doing. That paper, okay, I don't need that one. Set that notebook down. Okay. Nah, I'm good. You know, did something else, ran that back to this. Nah. Okay, I'll try again for the same album. Because that's going to the album. Same me, same album. I'll try again. Okay, so I'm gonna try again. You know what I mean? So when I laid there and thought about it, I decided to take heed on what that young, with that gentleman was saying about his music career, and how I, Solomon Paschal-Desbin, feel about mine own also. So, I listened to that album no time since then. I just remembered exactly what it was and was able to, it's funny. Within that album that I started working on, that kind of brought in some music. And, there are like individuals who were supposed to be somewhere else, like far, far away. I thought that they lived somewhere far away. You know, I thought that they were in another country to begin with. But I really didn't know too much about these people to begin with. Anyway. I kind of thought, or maybe not. Maybe thought I might have met them before. I don't know. I might have seen this person before. Might have not. Because I remember a few years ago, someone was like, "I'm a musician too." Like for real, I'm a musician too. I don't know if that was it. So I did this song, kind of sent it out to somebody, and they never made a song. I don't know. That's there you go. You I didn't hear too much of nothing from that album. It wasn't nothing to or fro about that. That was about 2014. Where I was doing some other stuff. And then I started working with this, person later on, years later, got nominated for Grammys. And it was funny because since we were working off of that first album in which this person was still kind of non-heard of, but heard of, but supposedly non-heard of, not as big as they are in pockets and familiarity as they are now. Um, so just a little, and then back to this guy, and then this guy way over there starts creating, on the other side of the nation, starts creating this music, immediately from what he discovered from my music, and he was kind of making it, but not really in tied to kind of like, where this other musician was. Yeah, but kind of not really. But then, on his take on his, with me doing mine, then I made some other music that, I was making so somewhere between the next two albums, I think since I said something and posted that song to that artist, they said something on some internet thing, and then like asked to listen and produce your music or to look at it and listen to it. So how did you get that? Was actually trying to clown you. So, and then later on, you know, after I made one album, this person made he made another album, but went bigger than I was prior before. Uh, it's actually quite actually a shame that that actually happened. So, when that musician had said that, maybe I had about 6 or 7 songs, I partially slept in the car, for they already had disco. I didn't know what type of music I was gonna make. you know, so, of course, pretty void and pretty fun. You know what I mean? So I just, you know, so that's pretty much, how, you know, I'm glad I heard that music. Yeah, they have an edition of that album now that's drumless, a drumless version. Yeah, I know how that feels.